The mail-order bride stood rejected on the train platform, her dark skin and modest features deemed too ugly for a respectable rancher's wife. Dust swirled around Ellie Ripley's worn boots as Rhett Morrison circled her like livestock at auction. His voice carried across the wooden planks where curious townspeople had gathered. "This ain't what was promised in them letters." Morrison's words cut through the afternoon heat. "I asked for a bride, not this." His gesture swept dismissively over her traveling dress and the careful way she held her spine straight despite the humiliation burning in her chest. The leather portfolio clutched against her ribs felt heavier now, weighted with secrets that might never matter in this dusty corner of Colorado territory. "Find your own way back to whatever hole you crawled from." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some faces showed disgust. Others revealed the uncomfortable recognition of witnessing cruelty they lacked courage to challenge. Ellie's fingers tightened on her carpetbag's handle. She had traveled 800 miles for this moment. The careful letters exchanged over months had painted pictures of partnership and new beginnings. Morrison turned his back and strode toward his waiting carriage. The driver avoided eye contact as he flicked the reins. Wheels rolled away through the dirt, leaving Ellie standing alone beside the train that had already begun its journey to the next town. The platform emptied slowly. Conversations resumed in hushed tones that carried judgment and dismissal. Ellie lowered herself onto her trunk, the only possession too large for her arms. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows between the buildings of Redemption Valley. Her reflection wavered in the window of the general store across the street. She had known this was possible. The letters from Morrison had been too eager, too willing to overlook questions about her background. But desperation makes fools of everyone, and she had needed to believe in the possibility of belonging somewhere. Footsteps approached across the weathered boards. Ellie looked up to find a man standing nearby, his hat casting shadows across weathered features. He wore the practical clothes of someone who worked with his hands. Dust covered his boots and the cuffs of his shirt. Something in his stance suggested he had been watching the entire scene unfold. "Name's Arthur Morgan." His voice carried the roughness of a man more comfortable with cattle than conversation. Ellie studied his face for signs of mockery or pity. She found neither. "Ellie Ripley, you got anywhere to go?" The question hung between them like smoke from a distant fire. Ellie considered lying, claiming family or friends in town. Pride demanded she refuse charity from strangers. But the sun was already settling toward the horizon, and she had counted her remaining coins 3 times during the train journey. "No." Arthur nodded as if her honesty confirmed something he had suspected. He glanced toward the direction Morrison's carriage had disappeared, and his jaw tightened with what might have been anger or disgust. "I got a ranch about 5 miles out. Could use help with bookkeeping and mending." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "Pay ain't much, but there's a room in the main house and meals." Ellie searched his expression for the catch. Men didn't offer assistance to women like her without expecting something in return. The silence stretched between them while she calculated risks and alternatives. The next train wouldn't arrive for 3 days, and she lacked funds for a hotel room even if one would accept her. Why? The single word carried the weight of every disappointment she had learned to expect. Arthur's gaze shifted to the mountains rising beyond the town's edge. When he looked back, something in his eyes reminded her of her own carefully guarded hope. "Ain't right, what just happened?" He lifted her trunk without waiting for permission. The gesture was practical rather than gallant. Ellie followed him toward a wagon hitched behind the train station. Her boots clicked against the platform boards with each step away from the life she had imagined toward one she couldn't yet picture. The wagon bed held supplies from town. Flour sacks and coils of rope suggested a working ranch, rather than the prosperous spread Morrison had claimed to own. Arthur secured her trunk between bags of grain and offered his hand to help her onto the seat. As they rolled away from Redemption Valley, Ellie clutched her leather portfolio and wondered what new form of disappointment awaited her. The landscape stretched endless and unforgiving in all directions. Mountains rose like broken promises against the sky. Arthur kept his attention on the rutted road ahead. Neither spoke as the wagon wheels found their rhythm and the town shrank behind them. The silence felt different from the hostile quiet that had surrounded her rejection. This carried possibility alongside uncertainty. The sun touched the peaks as they approached a collection of buildings that looked worn but functional. A house, barn, and several outbuildings arranged around a yard where chickens pecked at scattered feed. Everything spoke of work and purpose rather than prosperity. Arthur pulled the wagon to a stop near the front porch and climbed down. He lifted her trunk as easily as he had before and carried it toward the house. Ellie remained on the wagon seat, studying this place that might become home or might become another disappointment to add to her collection. The door of the house stood open, revealing rooms lit by the last daylight filtering through windows. Arthur set her trunk just inside the threshold and returned to where she waited. Rooms upstairs. Second door on the right. He gestured toward the stairs visible through the doorway. Ellie finally climbed down from the wagon, her legs stiff from the journey and the weight of uncertainty. Supper's in an hour if you're hungry. Arthur began unhitching the horses with the efficient movements of long practice. Ellie picked up her carpet bag and stepped across the threshold into whatever came next. Dawn arrived gray and cold across Arthur's ranch. Ellie woke to the sound of cattle lowing in distress and boots crossing the yard below her window. She dressed quickly and descended to find Arthur already gone, the coffee pot still warm on the stove. Through the kitchen window, she watched him examining a cow that stood apart from the herd. Its ribs showed through dull hide. Others grazed nearby in similar condition. The grass beneath their hooves looked sparse and yellowed despite the recent rains. The kitchen table held scattered papers weighted down by empty tin cans, bills, notices, letters marked with urgent stamps and threatening language. Ellie's fingers traced the edges without reading the contents. Arthur's handwriting appeared on some documents, crude and labored. When he returned an hour later, dust covered his shirt and exhaustion lined his face. He poured coffee without meeting her eyes. Lost another one in the night. The words carried weight beyond their simple meaning. Ellie had grown up around enough hardship to recognize the sound of a man counting losses he couldn't afford. "May I look at your books?" Arthur's hand stilled on his coffee cup. His gaze moved to the scattered papers, then to her face. Something shifted in his expression. Suspicion mixed with what might have been hope. "You read numbers." "Some." He gathered the papers into a rough pile and placed them before her. His movements carried the careful pride of a man revealing his shame. The documents told a story of mounting debts and declining income, feed costs that exceeded cattle sales, interest payments that multiplied faster than his ability to meet them. Ellie arranged the papers into categories while Arthur watched from across the table. His breathing grew shallow as she worked, as if her examination might somehow make the situation worse than it already was. The largest debt bore Morrison's name at the bottom. The amount made her stomach tighten. Arthur owed the man who had rejected her more money than the ranch could generate in 2 good years. How long? 6 months before he can call it due. Arthur's voice had gone flat. He stared out the window toward the struggling cattle. Ellie studied his profile and saw the resignation of a man who had already accepted defeat. The next morning she began reorganizing his record-keeping. Arthur left early to check fence lines and returned to find neat columns of figures arranged across clean paper. Income and expenses separated into categories that revealed patterns his scattered approach had hidden. "You're spending twice what you need on feed." She showed him the calculations. The feed store in town charged premium prices for supplies he could get cheaper from ranches closer to the railroad. Arthur squinted at her neat handwriting, his lips moving silently as he worked through the numbers. Never learned proper reading. The admission came quietly, without self-pity. Ellie nodded as if he had shared information about the weather. That afternoon she began teaching him to recognize written numbers and basic arithmetic. Arthur proved a careful student. his calloused fingers gripping the pencil with the same attention he gave to rope work. Their routine developed naturally. Mornings spent on ranch work, afternoons at the kitchen table with books and papers spread between them. Arthur showed her how to sit a horse properly, how to hold a rifle without fearing the kick. Ellie showed him how letters formed words and words formed meaning. The work suited them both. Arthur's ranch began showing signs of improvement. Fences repaired with materials bought at better prices. Cattle moved to pastures that had been resting while others were overgrazed. Small efficiencies that added up to hope, but the largest debt remained. Morrison's name appeared on too many documents, always with terms that favored the lender over the borrower. Arthur grew quiet whenever those papers surfaced during their work sessions. 3 weeks after Ellie's arrival, the first trouble appeared. Arthur found fence posts pulled up along the northern boundary, wire coiled and abandoned in the grass. Cattle scattered across 2 sections that should have been contained. He spent the morning gathering the herd and repairing the damage. That evening he cleaned his rifle with more attention than usual. Could be just weather working the posts loose. Ellie heard the doubt in his voice. She had seen the clean cuts in the wire, the way the posts lay arranged rather than fallen. Arthur knew as well as she did that weather didn't work with such precision. The second incident came 4 days later. Water troughs overturned during the night, forcing Arthur to spend precious hours hauling replacement water while cattle waited. No tracks in the dirt around the troughs. No signs of the wind or storm that might explain the damage. Arthur began rising earlier, spending more time riding the boundaries of his property. He carried the rifle now, though he never spoke of expecting to use it. The improvements to the ranch continued, but tension settled over the work like dust that wouldn't wash clean. Ellie found herself watching the horizon more often. The mountains that had seemed protective now felt like hiding places for eyes that meant harm. She had escaped one form of rejection only to find herself caught in someone else's troubles. The pattern of harassment established itself over the following weeks. Small damages that cost time and money to repair. Missing tools that appeared days later in distant corners of the property. Cattle spooked by riders who disappeared before Arthur could reach them. Never enough damage to justify involving the sheriff. Always just enough to drain resources and nerves. Arthur's jaw grew tight with the constant vigilance. His hands developed the habit of resting near his gun belt even when he worked around the house. One evening, as they worked through arithmetic problems by lamplight, Ellie found herself studying Arthur's face in the flickering shadows. The harsh lines around his eyes spoke of worries beyond cattle and crops. This harassment felt personal in ways that simple mischief couldn't explain. "Why does Morrison want your ranch?" Arthur's pencil stopped moving across the paper. His gaze remained fixed on the numbers they had been calculating. The silence stretched between them until the lamp wick began to sputter. "Good grazing land." The answer came too quickly, too simple. Ellie had seen Morrison spread during her brief time in town. He owned more grazing land than his cattle could use. Arthur was hiding something, the same way she kept her leather portfolio locked and private. That night she lay awake listening to the wind move through the eaves of the house. Somewhere in the darkness beyond her window, enemies she couldn't name were planning the next small cruelty designed to drive Arthur from land he couldn't afford to lose. The morning brought frost and another overturned water trough. Arthur repaired the damage without comment, but she saw him counting the cattle twice to make sure none had wandered off during the night. Winter was coming. The harassment would only increase as the weather made every setback more costly. Morrison's debt would come due whether the ranch prospered or failed. Ellie touched the leather portfolio where it rested in her room upstairs. Inside lay papers that might change everything, but revealing them would mean trusting Arthur with secrets she had guarded since leaving Charleston. Trust was a luxury she had learned to live without. The harassment escalated with the October cold. Arthur found 3 fence sections destroyed in a single night, wire cut with precision that spoke of deliberate malice rather than accident. Cattle scattered across the valley like spilled grain. He spent 2 days gathering them while Ellie waited at the house, rifle loaded and resting against the kitchen window. The isolation pressed against her shoulders during those long hours of watching empty horizon. She had survived rejection and abandonment, but this felt different. This carried the weight of someone else's fight, consequences she didn't understand for crimes she hadn't committed. When Arthur returned on the second evening, dust and exhaustion covered him like a second skin. He unsaddled his horse without speaking, his movements sharp with suppressed anger. Ellie heated water for coffee and waited for him to find words for whatever was eating at him. Found tracks near the north fence. The statement hung between them while steam rose from their cups. Arthur's gaze remained fixed on the table where her neat columns of figures showed the ranch finally turning profitable. All that progress threatened by enemies who struck from shadows. 3 riders, maybe 4. Ellie nodded as if she understood the mathematics of violence. In truth, she knew nothing about fighting beyond what desperation had taught her about surviving. But she recognized the sound of a man calculating odds that didn't favor him. That night she made her decision. The leather portfolio had waited long enough. Trust was a risk she had avoided since childhood, but isolation was proving more dangerous than revelation. Arthur sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle with methodical attention. The lamplight caught the metal parts as he assembled and disassembled the mechanism. His hands moved with the confidence of long familiarity, but tension held his shoulders rigid. Ellie retrieved the portfolio from her room and placed it on the table between them. Arthur's hands stilled on the rifle parts. He studied the worn leather and brass fittings without reaching for it. "Papers from my father." The words felt strange in her mouth. She had never spoken of him to anyone, not even in the letters to Morrison. Arthur set down the gun barrel and waited for her to continue. She opened the portfolio with careful fingers. Documents arranged in precise order, each one representing years of planning and hope. Land surveys that showed mineral deposits beneath the Colorado soil. Architectural drawings for mining operations and railroad spurs. Deeds that bore official seals and her father's careful signature. Arthur's eyes moved across the papers without comprehension at first. His reading lessons had progressed, but legal documents remained beyond his skills. Ellie spread the survey maps across the table and traced the boundary lines with her finger. 500 acres, including the water rights and everything beneath the ground. The land encompassed Arthur's ranch and extended north toward the mountains. Her inheritance made his struggling cattle operation a small corner of something much larger. Arthur studied the maps with growing understanding, his finger following the lines that redrew his world. Where? 2 miles north of here, the place Morrison's men keep hitting when they cut your fences. The connection crystallized between them without need for further explanation. Morrison hadn't rejected her because of her appearance. He had recognized something in her bearing or her letters that suggested she was more than the desperate woman he had expected to manipulate. Arthur pushed back from the table and walked to the window. His reflection wavered in the glass, superimposed over the dark landscape beyond. Ellie gathered the papers and waited for him to speak. He knew. The words carried certainty and betrayal. Arthur turned from the window, his face hard with the kind of anger that comes from understanding how thoroughly you've been used. The marriage was just to get the land. Ellie nodded. She had suspected from the moment Morrison circled her on the platform. His rejection too quick and decisive to be simple prejudice. Men like him didn't correspond with women they couldn't stomach looking at unless profit justified the distaste. When he saw you weren't going to be easy to control, he switched to driving you away. Arthur began pacing the small room, his boots echoing against the wooden floor. The rifle lay forgotten on the table beside Ellie's inheritance papers. Violence couldn't solve what legal documents had created. If you disappear, he can claim the land was abandoned. The mathematics of Morrison's plan revealed itself in brutal simplicity. Drive Ellie away through harassment and legal challenges. claim her property through abandonment or forge documents showing ownership through his intended marriage, sell the mineral rights to the railroad and profit from everyone else's work. Ellie folded the papers back into their careful arrangement. Her father had warned her that the inheritance would make her a target. She had imagined threats from strangers, not from the man who had promised to marry her. "Why help me?" The question emerged without her intending to ask it. Arthur stopped pacing and looked at her directly. Something in his expression shifted from anger to something more complicated. "Same reason you're helping me." The answer avoided explanation while containing it. They had both recognized something worth preserving in the other, something that justified risk and effort. Neither had named it directly, but it lived in the careful attention they paid to each other's comfort and progress. Arthur sat back down and reached for the survey maps. His finger traced the boundary lines again, this time with the attention of a man studying a battlefield rather than property descriptions. "He can't take it if you're here to defend it. The sheriff won't help. Half the town owes Morrison money or favors." They both knew the legal system wouldn't protect her claims against a white man with influence and resources. Justice in Colorado territory flowed toward money and connections rather than legal rights. "Then we defend it ourselves." Arthur's voice carried quiet determination rather than bravado. He began reassembling his rifle, the pieces clicking into place with mechanical precision. Ellie watched his hands work and felt something shift in her chest. Trust had been a luxury she couldn't afford. Now it felt like the only tool that might keep them both alive through what was coming. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows and moaning through the gaps in the house's weathered boards. Winter was approaching with the promise of isolation and vulnerability. Morrison's harassment would intensify when snow made every attack more costly to repair. But Ellie's papers changed the stakes of the conflict. Instead of defending a failing cattle ranch, they were protecting an inheritance worth more than Morrison's entire operation. The mineral rights alone could fund a dozen ranches and leave money for railroads and expansion. Arthur finished cleaning his rifle and set it against the wall within easy reach. His movements had lost their earlier tension, replaced by the focused calm of a man who understood his enemy and had decided to fight. "We'll need supplies before the first snow." Ellie nodded and began planning the practical requirements of siege: food, ammunition, medical supplies, winter clothes, and extra blankets. Enough of everything to survive months without leaving the ranch. The fire burned low while they worked through lists and calculations. Outside, the wind carried the scent of coming weather and the promise of a hard season ahead. But inside the small house, two people who had found each other by accident prepared to defend what they were building together. Neither spoke of love or permanence. Those were luxuries for people who survived their immediate troubles. But something had grown between them that felt worth fighting for, whether or not they had words to describe it. November brought the first serious snow, fat flakes that fell without wind and accumulated in drifts against the north walls of the buildings. Arthur had spent the previous week moving the cattle closer to the barn and reinforcing the feed stores. Ellie helped where she could, her hands growing stronger with each day of ranch work. The storm arrived on a Tuesday morning with the suddenness of mountain weather. What began as scattered flakes became a wall of white that erased the horizon. Arthur checked the animals one last time before the visibility disappeared entirely, then barred the barn doors against the wind that followed the snow. By evening they were trapped inside the house with nothing but firelight and each other's company. The world beyond the windows had vanished into a howling void that made the walls seem thin as paper. Ellie moved closer to the hearth, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. Arthur fed split logs into the flames and watched sparks disappear up the chimney. The storm's isolation pressed against them both, creating an intimacy that daylight and routine had kept at bay. Conversation felt both necessary and dangerous in the flickering warmth of the small room. "Tell me about him." Ellie's question came quietly, almost lost in the wind's noise. Arthur understood without need for clarification. She was asking about Morrison, about the history that had made his harassment personal rather than simply business. Worked for him when I first came to Colorado. Arthur's voice carried the weight of old mistakes. He stared into the fire while choosing words from memories he preferred to leave buried. Good pay, steady work. Thought he was giving me a chance when he offered to stake me to this place. The flames cast shadows across his weathered features. Ellie waited without pressure, understanding that some stories required their own pace to be told properly. Wasn't charity, was a trap. Arthur rose and walked to the window, though nothing was visible through the storm-covered glass. His reflection wavered against the darkness, a ghost superimposed over the white chaos beyond. Loan terms were designed to fail, interest rates that jumped after the first year, payment schedules that didn't account for bad weather or cattle prices. Ellie felt the familiar weight of being used by someone who smiled while calculating profit from your desperation. Her father had warned her about men who offered help with strings attached, but desperation made people ignore warnings they couldn't afford to heed. He wanted me to fail so he could take the land back along with all the improvements I'd made. Arthur returned to the fire and sat across from Ellie. The confession had cost him something, revealing himself as a man who had been fooled by false friendship and fair promises. But you didn't fail. Not yet. The admission hung between them while wind rattled the windows and snow continued to erase the familiar landscape outside. Ellie understood that Arthur's success had made him more dangerous to Morrison than his failure would have been. The storm continued through the night and into the next day. They took turns feeding the fire and checking that snow wasn't blocking the chimney. Simple tasks that required coordination and trust. Arthur showed Ellie how to bank coals to keep warmth through the coldest hours. She shared the careful rationing of supplies that could stretch resources when the future remained uncertain. On the second night, the wind died, leaving them in a silence more profound than the storm's noise had been. Snow still fell, but gently now, without the violent urgency that had characterized the blizzard's arrival. The house creaked and settled around them while the fire burned lower. I knew about Morrison before I came. Ellie's voice was so quiet Arthur almost missed the words. He looked up from the coals he had been arranging and found her watching him with an expression he couldn't read. My father warned me that the inheritance would attract men who saw opportunity rather than partnership. She pulled her knees up and wrapped her arms around them, making herself smaller in the chair by the fire. The confession was costing her the same effort Arthur's had required. The letters from Morrison were too eager, too willing to overlook questions about my background and family. Arthur understood without explanation. Morrison had been fishing for information about her resources while presenting himself as simply lonely and ready to marry. The correspondence had been courtship and reconnaissance combined. But you came anyway. Ellie nodded, her gaze fixed on the dying flames. The firelight caught the curve of her cheek and the determined set of her jaw. Even in admission of poor judgment, she carried herself with the dignity of someone who owned her choices. Hoped I was wrong. Hoped desperation was making me see threats that weren't there. The honesty cut through the careful politeness they had maintained since her arrival. Arthur saw past the surface of their arrangement to the calculation and risk that had brought them both to this isolated house in the Colorado mountains. When he rejected you on the platform, wasn't surprised, was relieved. Arthur's eyebrows rose at the unexpected response. Ellie's slight smile held no warmth, just the bitter satisfaction of having dangerous suspicions confirmed. Better to know immediately than discover it after the wedding. They sat in comfortable silence while snow continued to fall outside and the fire burned toward embers. The storm had forced truths between them that careful daily routine had kept buried. Neither felt the need to fill the quiet with unnecessary words. Arthur rose to add another log to the fire. The flames climbed higher, pushing back the shadows that had been creeping closer. When he returned to his chair, Ellie was studying his face with the same careful attention she gave to financial calculations. Why did you really help me? The question she had asked before returned with different weight now. Their confessions had changed the context, made honest answers both possible and necessary. Arthur considered deflecting again, but the storm's intimacy made dishonesty feel like cowardice. He met her gaze directly. Recognized something. What? Same thing that made Morrison nervous. Ellie tilted her head, inviting explanation without demanding it. Arthur searched for words to describe what he had seen in her bearing on the platform, the quality that had made Morrison's rejection seem like fear rather than disgust. You weren't broken. The simple statement carried layers of meaning. Arthur had seen plenty of desperate people, men and women ground down by circumstances until they accepted whatever treatment they received. Ellie had carried herself differently, even in the moment of public humiliation. Most folks in your situation would have begged or cried or tried to change his mind. Arthur's voice grew quiet with memory of that afternoon on the platform. You just waited to see what came next. Ellie absorbed this observation in silence. She had never thought of her reaction as strength, only as the practical response of someone who had learned that pleading rarely changed outcomes. The fire settled into steady burning while they sat without speaking. Outside, the storm was ending as gradually as it had begun. By morning, they would be able to dig out and assess whatever damage the weather had caused. But something had shifted between them during the enforced intimacy of the blizzard. Walls had come down that couldn't be rebuilt exactly as they had been. They understood each other now in ways that made their partnership feel less like mutual convenience and more like conscious choice. Arthur banked the coals for the night while Ellie climbed the stairs to her room. Neither spoke of what would happen when the storm ended and the outside world returned with its demands and dangers. But both carried the memory of confessions shared by firelight and the knowledge that trust was no longer just a luxury they couldn't afford. The storm's aftermath revealed Morrison's escalation. Arthur found 20 head of cattle scattered across 3 miles of valley, driven from their shelter during the blizzard's worst hours. 2 hadn't survived the exposure. Their frozen forms lay twisted in snow drifts, testament to cruelty that used weather as a weapon. Arthur stood over the lost animals while wind cut through his coat. His hands worked methodically to gather the rope he'd used trying to pull them to safety. The effort had come too late. Morrison's timing had been precise, calculated to maximize suffering and loss. Ellie waited at the house, rifle ready and positioned by the window that offered the best view of approaching riders. They had agreed that someone should always remain armed and watching. Trust had grown between them, but vigilance kept them alive. When Arthur returned that evening, ice crystals clung to his beard and exhaustion weighted his movements. He unsaddled his horse without speaking, his attention focused on tasks that didn't require acknowledgement of what he'd found. How many? Ellie's question came quietly. Arthur's silence provided the answer before he found words for the loss. 2 dead, rest scattered from here to the next county. The mathematics of Morrison's harassment had shifted from harassment to destruction. Killing cattle crossed lines that fence-cutting hadn't approached. This felt like the prelude to something worse. That night, Arthur cleaned his rifle with extra attention while Ellie organized their remaining supplies. The storm had used more food and fuel than expected. Another harsh weather event could leave them vulnerable in ways that had nothing to do with Morrison's malice. We need to get to town. Arthur's observation carried reluctance along with necessity. The trip would require leaving the ranch undefended, but they couldn't survive the winter on what remained in their stores. Together, Ellie's response brooked no argument. They had passed the point where separation felt safe. Morrison's escalation suggested he was moving towards some final confrontation that wouldn't wait for convenient timing. They rode to Redemption Valley 3 days later, both armed and alert for signs of ambush along the familiar road. The town looked smaller in winter, buildings hunched against the cold and streets empty except for necessary traffic. Arthur tied the horses outside the general store while Ellie gathered their list: basic supplies and ammunition. enough to last until spring if they rationed carefully. The storekeeper accepted their money without comment, but his gaze lingered on Ellie in ways that felt calculating rather than merely curious. They were loading supplies into the wagon when Morrison appeared with three men Arthur didn't recognize. Hired help rather than local workers. Men whose clothes and weapons suggested they earned money through intimidation rather than honest labor. Morrison approached with the confidence of someone who controlled the situation completely. His smile held no warmth, just the satisfaction of a trap closing on schedule. "Arthur, Miss Ripley." The formal greeting carried mockery beneath its politeness. Morrison's gaze moved between them, noting their positioning and the rifles they carried. His hired men spread out casually, blocking potential escape routes. "Heard you lost some cattle in the storm." Morrison's voice carried false sympathy that fooled no one. Arthur's hand moved closer to his gun belt, a movement Morrison's men noted and matched. Shame when the weather turns against honest ranchers. The threat lay naked beneath Morrison's words. He was claiming responsibility for the cattle deaths while maintaining plausible deniability. Ellie stepped closer to Arthur, her own rifle held ready but not yet aimed. "Course, some folks aren't meant for ranch life." Morrison's attention focused on Ellie now, his gaze carrying the same dismissive assessment he'd shown on the train platform months earlier. "Might be time to consider other opportunities, before the weather gets worse." The ultimatum hung in the cold air between them. Morrison was offering one final chance to surrender before he escalated to methods that wouldn't leave them alive to refuse. Arthur's voice came steady and calm despite the tension crackling around them. "We're not going anywhere." Morrison's smile widened, showing teeth that reminded Ellie of a predator scenting wounded prey. He reached into his coat with deliberate slowness, making sure his movements couldn't be mistaken for drawing a weapon. "Thought you might say that." The papers he produced were legal documents bearing official seals and stamps. Morrison held them where Arthur and Ellie could see the formal language and threatening signatures. "Abandonment claim, filed yesterday with the territorial court." Ellie's stomach tightened as she recognized the trap closing around them. Morrison was claiming she had abandoned her inheritance, making it available for legitimate purchase by interested parties. "Got witnesses saying you left town the day you arrived. Never took possession of your father's property." The lie was brazen but potentially effective. Ellie's presence at Arthur's ranch could be interpreted as abandonment of her rightful inheritance. Morrison's influence with local officials would make his version of events seem credible. 30 days to contest the claim. Course, you'd need a lawyer for that. Morrison's tone suggested he knew no lawyer in the territory would take her case against him. Money and influence flowed in predictable directions, and neither favored a black woman fighting a prominent white rancher. Arthur stepped forward, his movement bringing him within arm's reach of Morrison. The hired men tensed, hands moving toward their weapons, but Morrison raised his hand to forestall violence. "She's not going anywhere either." Arthur's voice carried quiet finality. Morrison studied his expression, seeing something there that made his satisfied smile falter slightly. "That your final answer?" The question carried weight beyond its simple words. Morrison was offering one last opportunity for surrender before implementing whatever final solution he had prepared. "It is." Morrison nodded as if Arthur had confirmed something he'd expected. He folded the legal papers back into his coat and stepped away from the wagon. "Shame. Always liked you, Arthur." The past tense carried the weight of an ending. Morrison turned and walked toward his waiting men, his movements unhurried and confident. "Might want to be extra careful on the ride home. Road can be dangerous in winter." The threat followed them as they climbed onto the wagon seat. Arthur took the reins while Ellie kept her rifle ready and her attention on Morrison's men. The hired guns made no move to follow, but their presence promised future attention. They rode out of town in silence, both scanning the horizon for signs of pursuit or ambush. The winter landscape offered too many hiding places, Too many opportunities for men who wanted to stage accidents that wouldn't raise uncomfortable questions. But the road remained empty, except for their wagon tracks cutting through snow that recorded their passage. Morrison was saving his final move for timing that suited his purposes better than a public confrontation in broad daylight. That night, they barred the doors and took turns standing watch. Arthur's debt to Morrison would come due in 6 weeks. The abandonment claim gave Morrison legal cover for taking Ellie's inheritance. All that remained was eliminating the witnesses who could challenge his version of events. Ellie sat by the window during her watch shift, rifle across her knees and eyes fixed on the moonlit yard beyond the glass. Somewhere in the darkness, enemies planned their next move while Winter waited to cover whatever tracks they might leave. The cold pressed against the windows and seeped through gaps in the walls. But inside the small house, two people who had found each other by accident prepared for whatever Morrison would bring with the next storm. Neither spoke of fear or flight. Those were luxuries for people who had other options. They had chosen each other in this place, and some choices were worth defending regardless of the cost. Morrison arrived with the sheriff and 2 deputies on the first clear morning after Christmas. Arthur spotted the riders from the barn where he'd been checking the horses. 4 men against 2, with legal authority backing whatever Morrison had planned. Ellie emerged from the house carrying her leather portfolio and wearing her finest dress. She had spent the early morning preparing for this confrontation, arranging papers and steeling herself for the fight that would determine everything. Morrison dismounted near the porch with theatrical confidence. His smile carried the satisfaction of a man who believed he held all the winning cards. The sheriff remained on his horse, his expression uncomfortable but compliant. "Miss Ripley, time to settle this abandonment business." Morrison's voice carried across the yard with false regret. He gestured toward the legal papers the sheriff held, documents that would strip away her inheritance through bureaucratic theft. "Afraid you'll need to vacate the property you've been illegally occupying." Ellie descended the porch steps with measured grace. Her bearing showed no trace of the desperate woman who had been rejected on the train platform months earlier. Arthur moved to stand beside her, his rifle held casually but ready. "I haven't abandoned anything." Ellie's voice carried quiet authority that made Morrison's confident expression flicker. She opened her portfolio and withdrew a document that caught the morning light on its official seals. Railroad company correspondence, dated 2 weeks ago. Morrison's face went pale as he recognized the letterhead. His scheme depended on Ellie being isolated and powerless. Communication with outside authorities threatened everything. "I've been in direct contact with the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad." Ellie unfolded the letter and read from it in clear, carrying tones. The document acknowledged her ownership of mineral rights and requested a meeting to discuss purchase terms. "Seems they're very interested in my property." Morrison lunged for the papers, but Arthur stepped between them. The sheriff's hand moved toward his weapon, then stopped as he processed what he'd heard. Railroad companies carried influence that exceeded even Morrison's local power. Moreover, Ellie's voice cut through the tension before violence could erupt. She withdrew another document from her portfolio, this one bearing even more impressive seals and signatures. Stock certificates in the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad Company. The revelation hit Morrison like a physical blow. He staggered backward, his face cycling through disbelief, rage, and fear as the implications became clear. "My father left me more than land. He left me ownership in the company that wants to buy it." The sheriff read over the certificates with growing unease. His loyalty to Morrison couldn't survive the realization that he'd been asked to dispossess a railroad company shareholder. "This changes things, Morrison." The lawman's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone distancing himself from a collapsing conspiracy. He handed the legal papers back to Morrison without executing the eviction they contained. Morrison's hired guns shifted nervously as they watched their employer's confident plan crumble. Railroad companies had resources to pursue justice that individual settlers couldn't access. Attacking their shareholders invited retaliation that local influence couldn't deflect. You can't prove any of this. Morrison's voice cracked with desperation. He was grasping for legal technicalities that might salvage his scheme, but the evidence was overwhelming. I don't need to prove it. Ellie's response carried the cold satisfaction of complete victory. She gestured toward the horizon where dust clouds marked approaching riders. They're here to verify it themselves. The railroad company representatives arrived with the punctuality of people accustomed to making important meetings on schedule. 3 men in expensive suits who dismounted from a well-appointed carriage and approached with the confidence of legitimate authority. Morrison's shoulders sagged as he recognized the futility of his position. His scheme had depended on Ellie being friendless and ignorant of her rights. Instead, she had outmaneuvered him with resources he hadn't known existed. Miss Ripley. The lead railroad representative removed his hat respectfully. His greeting acknowledged her not as a supplicant, but as a business partner worthy of courtesy. We're prepared to discuss your proposal. Morrison watched his dreams of easy wealth dissolve as Ellie conducted negotiations with the practiced ease of someone born to business. Her education and breeding showed themselves in ways his prejudice had blinded him to recognizing. The final terms were generous but not excessive. Ellie retained ownership of the surface land while selling mineral rights at prices that reflected their true value. The railroad gained access to resources they needed while she secured independence that no one could steal or challenge. Arthur stood quietly through the negotiations, understanding that he was witnessing Ellie's transformation from refugee to proprietor. She no longer needed his protection or partnership for survival. The question remained whether she would still want it. Morrison left with his men, defeated and financially ruined by debts he could no longer service. His threats had been revealed as empty posturing by someone who lacked the power to make good on them. The sheriff followed, eager to distance himself from the collapsed conspiracy. As the dust settled from their departure, Arthur began walking toward the barn. He moved with the careful dignity of someone accepting defeat without bitterness. Ellie had achieved everything she'd come west to accomplish. His role in her story was finished. "Where are you going?" Ellie's question stopped him halfway across the yard. Arthur turned to find her watching him with an expression he couldn't read. "Figured you'd want me to clear out." The assumption hung between them while wind moved through the empty spaces their enemies had vacated. Arthur had helped her survive Morrison's threats, but survival no longer required his assistance. "Why would I want that?" Ellie approached him with the same measured steps she'd used facing down Morrison's legal challenge. Her gaze held his without wavering. "You don't need me anymore." Arthur's voice carried the resignation of someone who understood that partnerships based on necessity rarely survived success. He had served his purpose in her larger plan, whether intentionally or accidentally. "Maybe I don't need you." Ellie's response made Arthur's chest tighten with anticipated rejection, but she continued before he could turn away. "Maybe I want you." The distinction carried weight that transformed everything between them. Need was temporary, driven by circumstances that could change. Want was choice, renewable daily through conscious decision. Arthur studied her face, searching for pity or obligation that might disguise itself as affection. He found neither. Instead, he saw the same careful evaluation she applied to business decisions, the same weighing of options and consequences. Equal partners. Ellie's proposal carried the formality of a contract and the intimacy of a vow. She was offering not rescue or charity, but genuine collaboration between people who had chosen each other for reasons beyond necessity. Arthur nodded once, accepting terms that honored them both. They had found each other through Morrison's cruelty, but they would stay together through their own choice. 6 months later, their combined ranch prospered as a stopping point for railroad construction crews. Ellie taught reading and arithmetic to local children in a schoolhouse built with railroad money. Arthur managed their cattle operation with the confidence of someone who understood both the work and the numbers behind it. Morrison worked as a hired hand on a distant spread, his letter of apology arriving with spring wildflowers. Some people learned humility through defeat. Others found strength through partnership. Ellie stood in the doorway of their schoolhouse, watching Arthur demonstrate proper roping technique to a group of fascinated children. The man who had offered her work when she was desperate had become the partner who shared her success when she was powerful. True love, she had learned, wasn't someone seeing past her supposed flaws. It was someone seeing her completely and choosing to build a life as her equal. The difference had made all the difference in a world that was still learning to recognize the worth of people it had been taught to overlook. And that is all to the story for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. And if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.